Hey, how's it going there, class? This is going to be our week 2 lecture. So we're going to be talking about the causes of psychopathology. So please, before we get started, go ahead and make sure that you have your notes out, you're ready to go, have something to write with, make sure you're in a place where you can pay attention. It's going to be very important to listen carefully. So remember, just watching these lectures alone will not get you the grade that you need, okay? All right, and don't forget to do those participation points, and don't forget to do the reading quiz. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. But before that, how about a brief message from our corporate sponsors? All right, we'll be back in a moment. Oh, yeah, that was great. All right, so that's a message from our sponsors. Remember, you know, do what they say. You see what I'm talking about? All right. So let's go ahead and get started here. This is going to be the video. So just like last week, what I'm going to do, I'm going to press play on the video. I'm going to move away for a bit, and then I'm just going to watch. And if I see something that I want to correct or change, I might jump in and make some changes. Again, we have the old videos on Compass, so you can sit there and you can watch those old videos. That would be just these videos by themselves, uninterrupted. So if you don't like this format, that's fine. You're not required to watch this format. Just jump in the other folder. But, this is what I'm going to do this semester. And yeah, it is what it is. All right, let's see what's going on. All right, everybody. So today is going to be our week 2 lecture. And we are going to be talking about the causes of psychopathology. And then we're going to get into some classification. So go ahead and go on the Compass. No, this is not even a joke. This is not even a joke. Look, I'm wearing the same shirt. I'm wearing the same shirt. Look at this. Look at this dude. Oh my god, I'm wearing the same shirt. What the? Did I plan this? No, I didn't plan this, right? No, I didn't. No. Anyways, okay. That's not going to be on the quiz. I'm sorry. I'm wearing the same shirt. All right. Hey, who wore it better? 2020 Walter or 2021 Walter, right? All right, let's get going. Download the slides, follow along. Let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to start with 4 psychological paradigms. Then we're going to get into a little bit of systems theory, and then we're going to go over biological and genetic theories. And then we're going to transition into classification. So first things first, what is a paradigm? So a paradigm is a shared set of assumptions about a particular theory, about how psychologists or scientists should conceptualize psychopathology, measure and test different hypotheses. A way to think about this is your schema, the filter through which you view psychopathology. So there's going to be 4 psychological paradigms we're going to talk about in this section. We have psychodynamic, cognitive, behavioral, humanistic, and biological. First thing we're going to talk about is this guy right here. This is Sigmund Freud, father of psychoanalysis, right? So psychoanalysis was a theory and also a therapy that Sigmund Freud created. So this is where you sit down on a couch, you talk about things that happened in your past, and then psychopathology comes from these early childhood experiences, these internal struggles that you have within yourself, and this leads to psychopathology. Even though his psychoanalysis is both a treatment and a theory, his followers that came later, who followed the teachings of Sigmund Freud, all of those are encapsulated through this psychodynamic paradigm. So what you have like Carl Jung, Melanie Klein, Alfred Adler, you have Anna Freud, Erik Erikson. So a lot of the treatments, or I should say, this is talk therapy, right? So you've heard that term before, talk therapy. This is where you sit down and you're talking to somebody about your problems. They ask you questions, you go back and forth, and then you start to dig a little bit deeper. That's psychodynamic. That's where a lot of that treatment came from. So you're not really trying to get in there and change people's thoughts about things or, give them new behaviors. You're talking with them, trying to help them work their issues out. Of course, the basis of this, I mean, you might see this used in a lot of other different treatments as well. You might start by talking things out, but then you might move into something else. But, Freud believed that deep down inside of you, there was something that happened Usually had to do with you wanting to have sex with your mother or father or discovering your genitals. Sorry, kids. Yeah, I mean, that's what Sigmund Freud was all about. Read his books. But, I mean, he felt like something happened. There was something deep down, some deeper issue. And if you got to that deeper issue, you could, help the person. These are all individuals that follow the psychodynamic paradigm, which came from the psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic and psychodynamic are often like confused. They're often seen as being like interchangeable, and to some extent they kind of are. But it's important to understand that when we're talking about Sigmund Freud specifically, his theory and his therapy is psychoanalysis. But psychoanalysis, the theory, and the therapy is under the umbrella of psychodynamic. And because psychodynamic includes the theories and practices of Sigmund Freud, but also the way his followers advance that. Okay, so now we got this guy right here. Who's this guy? B.F. Skinner. Those of you who took Psych 100 should know about the Skinner box. All right, so B.F. Skinner, he's considered as one of the fathers of the cognitive behavioral paradigm. And so the cognitive paradigm focuses pretty much on how people's perceptions of, or their thoughts around situations influences their emotional and their behavioral reactions. So an individual's perceptions when it comes to cognitive behavioral might be distorted or dysfunctional, and this leads to psychopathology. So, looking at B.F. Skinner and the things that he taught, the focus of cognitive behavioral is on the observable behavior of the individual, and the cause of psychopathology is the social learning from your parents, from your friends, from society that leads to maladaptive functioning. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. We'll talk about CBT. It's important to kind of think about this when we're looking at the cognitive behavioral behavior, reacts to situations. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the humanistic approach, or the humanistic paradigm, I should say. And so this is championed by Carl Rogers, and so you often heard this referred to as Rogerian. The way this works is with humanist, these are all terms relating to how when we're looking at the study of the whole person, and how everybody is unique, and how everybody has a different path, a different perspective, or a different way of expressing themselves. And so this is different from behaviorism and psychodynamic. When it comes to individuals, this perspective believe that behaviorists and psychodynamic is too deterministic. Big focus of the humanistic approach is going to be the free will of the individual and how the individual should be valued. Focuses of psychopathology when it comes to humanistic is going to be the frustration that occurs between the individual and society, friction encountered in society, and individuals not able to achieve their ideal self. Alright, so then the last one we're going to talk about here, this is going to be the biological paradigm. So as you can probably already fill in the gaps, the biological paradigm has to do... Alright, just want to touch base real quick about the humanistic. So this is like unconditional positive regard for the client. This is like viewing that people have free will. So determinism is like, determinism is like an RPG. You roll the dice, you get a series of numbers, and then you put those numbers into different stats. And those stats will determine how you make it through your life. So determinism is like, okay, whatever kind of issue that you have, this is going to affect every area of your life, and it's going to lead you to where you're going to go. So like, yeah, you're born with depression, you're just a depressed person, you're just going to do this depression stuff. There's nothing you could ever do. You were born to be depressed. And then with humanism, it's a little bit different. You can be like, with the humanistic approach, you can be like, okay, you have some leeway there, you have some free will, you can make some changes, you can steer your own boat. And so don't quote me on that. I just want to give you like a better understanding. If that all confuses you, come to office hours, send me an email, come to the in-person discussion session starting sometime in the future. But we'll talk about it. All right. With your brain, neurochemicals, genetics, how these physiological dysfunction, the biological paradigm, if you were a purely biological paradigm individual, you would believe that all psychopathology arises from some kind of genetic defect, brain defect, some physiological defect, some kind of damage that led an individual to develop psychopathology. This is what you would believe if you are purely biological paradigm. Now, most people share or have a combination of these different paradigms, so you're not really going to meet a lot of people who are purely biological or purely psychodynamic or purely humanistic. Usually there's a good combination. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and get into the next part of our agenda. For this section, we're going to talk about systems theory. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with this, systems theory looks at how these different paradigms all combine. So we look at biological factors, we look at psychological factors, we look at societal factors, we look at all these different areas, and we try to see how these all combine and work together to develop psychopathology. This has also been referred to as the biopsychosocial model. These different paradigms can operate at like different levels of analyses. So this could be as broad as like your culture, the community, the family, within like interpersonal relationships. It can also go down to the individual with things like neurons, brain chemicals being out of balance, and how all of this connects together to create psychopathology. Okay, so when we think about systems theory, one of the big concepts we want to look at holism versus reductionism. So holism is going to be like you are more than the sum of your parts, right? So I can't just say 1 + 1 = depression, right? So 1 + 1 might equal 3. There might be some kind of effect there when you combine those two things together. Of course, I could just say multiplication, but this is not a simple formula. All right, when you combine everything together, the output might not be what you expect. So that's going to be holism. And there's going to be reductionism, which is the whole is the sum of its parts. So if I take 1 + 1, I'm going to get 2 every time. So I have this one, I have that one, and when I put them together, I'm going to get 2. So that's going to be reductionism. So we're thinking about psychopathology. Another way to think about this would be with water. Water is composed of 1 oxygen atom and then 2 oxygen atoms, right? Well, if I just have a bunch of oxygen over here and a bunch of hydrogen over there, right? These are gases. If I try to drink them, what's going to happen? You see what I'm talking about? But when they combine together, when they bond together, I get water, right? And so I just can't take oxygen here, hydrogen here, slap them together and get water. There's a process that's involved with creating water. So now let's keep on going with systems theory.
All right, and another way to think about this, that was probably a good explanation, probably. I don't know, I'm kind of biased because I made it up. I didn't make it up, Another way to think about this is like a cake, like you're making a cake, right? So you take some flour, some eggs, some sugar, some vanilla, a bunch of other ingredients, and if you just put those out onto the table, if I stick my finger in each ingredient, well, I'll probably get salmonella from the egg, but like, if I stick my finger in each ingredient, then I'll be like, wasn't that good? You know what I'm talking about? What's going on here? But when I mix all that together into a batter, so when they combine, when all those effects combine, and then I put them in the oven, so then some kind of interaction occurs, out of the oven comes a cake. So that would be holism. So reductionism would be if I stuck my finger in all the things, I tasted it, and it tastes like a cake, that'd be reductionism. Well, all these parts come together and they make a cake. But holism is all these parts, right, together, something additional has to occur. Something special happens when you mix all these ingredients together, right? And they become more than just the sum of these ingredients. So a cake batter, sure, people might like cake batter, but cake batter is not the same thing as the cake ingredients. And a baked cake isn't the same thing as cake batter. Something has changed. The sum of the parts are like the whole, the finished cake, the baked cake is greater than the ingredients put into that cake. Maybe that was terrible. If that was terrible, disregard.
So let's talk about the diathesis stress. So this is going to be very important because this combines a lot of the different paradigms together when we're talking about how psychopathology psychopathology arises. So what you have with the diathesis stress model, you have this psychological theory that says we have, like, individuals have this predisposed vulnerability to a particular disorder. This is known as a diathesis, which might be triggered through different stressors through our life experiences to create psychopathology. So this could be a genetic factor, this could be a psychological factor, this could be something physiological, this could be something, this vulnerability that I'm talking about. So these vulnerabilities can exist in a variety of different ways, and then once they encounter a sufficient stressor, then this could trigger psychopathology. Now, what's important, just because you have a diathesis and you encounter a stress doesn't mean that you're going to have or develop psychopathology. So you could have a diathesis that is never sufficiently triggered. In that case, you would actually probably never know that you have a diathesis. But just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, right? But just because you do have that doesn't mean that it is going to happen. You know, you couldn't just say, oh, look, your parents are alcoholics. That means you're going to be an alcoholic. I mean, that might happen, but you might not meet that sufficient trigger, or you might have other things that come in the way and stop that from happening. So let's go ahead and put this all up here for you. So when it comes to diathesis, it could be biological, so this is like your genes, your brain functioning, your neurochemicals. You have like social factors, so many social factors are socioeconomic status, racial discrimination. We have psychological factors, so this could be like your personality, this could be your learned history, your different behavioral things that you learned from social learning. Then we have right here, we have the stressors. We have biological triggers, social triggers, psychological triggers. These triggers don't have to be the same. So you could have a biological diathesis that is triggered, that has a social trigger. You could have a psychological diathesis that is triggered, that has a biological trigger. Okay? So these can all kind of mix and match. You have the diathesis, your predisposed vulnerability to a particular.
So if you're frustrated that my head was covering up that part right there that says disorder, just download the slides and you'll be fine. You should be downloading the slides anyways. I can tell that some of you are just watching the videos by the questions that you ask me on the email. Download the slides, please. While you're going over the lecture, look at the slides at the same time. Or maybe watch the video, listen to it, and then read the slides later. Okay, let's keep going.
Disorder, a sufficient stressor, and that leads to, boom, out the way, a disorder. So now let's talk a little bit more about systems theory.
And another way you can think about diathesis stress, this might be a little gory, but it's like a landmine. Imagine your mind is a field, and then I have these landmines, and I throw them out into the field, and I say, go ahead and walk. And you're walking around, and that walking is the experience. So you could pass through that field and never step on any of those landmines. But those landmines, I want you to think of them as a diathesis. If I'm walking around the field, and so this is me going through my experiences, and then I step on a landmine, I have now triggered the fuse. So that step onto the landmine would be the stress. And what happens next? Explosion. You know, the Five Bloods on Netflix. Don't watch it. So it's like you have this predisposition somewhere in your mind, or somewhere in your psyche, there's this predisposition. And then as you're going through life, something happens. A trigger occurs, and that causes a disorder to happen. You can even experience a cumulative effect of the diathesis stress model, where you have this trigger, and you're encountering these stresses, and they don't cause a disease. They don't cause a disorder. But then all of a sudden, something happens out of the ordinary, out of the norm. And so the 15th time this thing happens to you, it causes this disorder to occur. You might say to yourself, but the 14 times before it, nothing happened. Well, maybe it was a cumulative effect. We might get into that a little bit later in this semester. But if you have any questions on that, please send me an email, come to office hours or the in-person discussion session when they open up.
So right here, what we have is an example of these different life events. Death of a parent, a loss of a job, a neurotransmitter imbalance, and traumatic brain injury. These are all different pathways to depression, right? So we have multiple pathways to the same outcome. So this is going to be known as equifinality, where we have different causes that lead to the same disorder. So I couldn't just say, well,
All right, so I don't know if I go over this in the video, but one of the best ways to remember this is to break the word up. Equifinality. So we have two words there, right? So I can't port to it. Okay, equifinality, okay? So what do you think about? Equal, like equity, equality, stuff like that. You think about the same. You think about equal. Finality, what does finality mean? Final, finality, the end, the destination, the final destination, my favorite film series. So you have finality, equifinality, same end, same destination. Yeah, just like in Final Destination, because it was equifinality, because no matter what they did, the outcome was the same. Even the people who survived the earlier movies, in the later movies, they're gone. So it's just like equifinality. So if you don't know what equifinality is, watch Final Destination.
Only a death of a parent leads to depression. Only a loss of a job leads to depression. Because there's a variety of ways you might arrive at depression. So this is equifinality. There are different causes for the same disorder. Different roads leading to the same destination. So here, I have a single event. I have this earthquake. And this earthquake might lead to a phobia. This earthquake might lead to PTSD. This earthquake might lead to depression. So I have this one event that results in a variety of outcomes. And don't think about this as different outcomes within a single individual. Think about this as different people responding to the singular event a different way. So this is going to be multifinality. So multifinality would be you have a similar causal factors. You have people in a community that all experience this earthquake, but then some develop a phobia, some develop PTSD, and some develop depression, but it all has this common factor, this common cause, which is going to be the earthquake. So I can't say that everybody who is in an earthquake is going to have PTSD, because that's not true. Because in this example, they could have a phobia, they could have depression, but it all comes from this earthquake. So this is one way to think about this, that it all doesn't look the same. It's all not alike. So now we're going to talk about a different type of causality, and this is reciprocal causality. And you might have heard this referred to a downward spiral, and that's a good way to think about this. So think about a parent who's very strict with their child. The child rebels against the parent. And because the child is rebelling against the parent tries to be stricter to control the child's behavior, and the child rebels some more, right? So the strictness of the parent influences the child's behavior influences the parent's behavior, and you have this cycle. Causality is bidirectional. So I'm causing something to happen. This cause contributes this effect causes this effect. It's this cycle. Here's another example. So you have a person with depression. So the person with depression relies heavily on their friends. The friends feel the burden of trying to help the other friend with the depression. So then they kind of withdraw from the person. When the friends withdraw from the individual with depression, this makes them more depressed and causes them to want to reach out more to their friends, which causes them to withdraw, and then you have that negative cycle. So that causality is bidirectional. And we'll talk about this more later, but this is going to be the reciprocal causality, the downward spiral. When we're trying to think about where psychopathology comes from, we have a hard time pinpointing exactly what causes something, like what's the specific cause, right? So we have a hard time saying things like, this thing right here 100% causes psychopathology. So the way we want to think about this is a little bit different. We want to think about this in terms of risk factors, maintenance factors, and then protective factors. So whenever you read a study, the study is not proving anything. the study is finding evidence in support of some kind of causal link.
And I wanna definitely pause right here to let you know that this is serious. Like the only thing you can prove is math. You cannot prove anything else. There's nothing in existence that you can prove other than math. Everything else, you're just finding a chance of something. You're finding evidence in support of an outcome. So, people always get really snarky with this, like, oh, this will always cause this. Like, if you shoot somebody, they're always going to die. It's like, no, not really. Like, you can't prove anything. So, when you're writing your assignment, if you're using words like prove, this proves, this is proven, no, that's not scientific speak. That's sloppy speak. That's how people speak about things sloppily. Right? Don't speak in absolutes, right? Because proven is a dichotomous outcome. It's proven or it's unproven, right? So you provide evidence in support of something. And this happens all the time. It happens in commercials. It happens all over the place where people say proof, 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 proof. No, no, no. You're finding evidence in support of a hypothesis. This is definitely for your papers. Some of you have already written your papers. Don't do that. If you use the word prove, that's bad. You can't prove anything. Especially you. Like, I can barely prove anything, right? I know you can't prove nothing. So don't try to act like proving whatever. But you don't want to use these words. Proving, this is 100% true. This always happens. You don't want to say things like obviously or something like that. You want to try to explain how there's uncertainty. This is why it's hard to talk about misinformation, because misinformation is spread through absolutes. And it's hard to then go to an absolute and try to, disentangle what's wrong through nuance. So like people don't like subtleties. They don't like uncertainties. They don't like nuance. They like absolutes. This is right. This is wrong. This is real. This is fake. People love that stuff. That's not how life works. Life is gray. Life is super gray, man. So just like, hey, chillax a little bit. Let's get scientific. Don't say the word proven. You don't have enough evidence to prove anything. Let's just keep it going.
Some kind of contributing factor to the psychopathological outcomes. So it's very hard to say this study proves that video games cause violence in kids. That's hard. You could say video game contributes to violence in kids. You could say that. This provides evidence in support of the assertion that video games cause or contributes to the level of violence in a child. But it's hard to say video games cause violence. Also, one study doesn't make a thing. So just because you read a study about something doesn't mean this is a thing now. Like it wasn't just like one study that said, look, this is depression. This is how depression works. No. There's multiple studies coming at it from different angles. So what we're looking for are things like risk factors, right? What sets somebody...
That's another point I want to talk about. So some of you ask me about using outside sources. So rather than using things like lecture, the DSM-5, or research articles, you'll actually pull news articles that quote some random study and say, look at what this study has found. Or you'll be part of like an organization or something, and your organization has an ethos, or your organization believes in certain things. And so they'll put out publications in terms of like articles online, pamphlets, things like that. And within those pamphlets, they're expressing views that really might not be backed by science. Or maybe they did a study where they went out and they surveyed people and they found some results, and then they published this independently and said, this is what we found. And this is very important to understand, that one study does not find a thing. So one of the great examples of this is the link between autism and vaccines, or I should say vaccines and autism. The guy who did this study, it was one study, it had a very small N. So that's the number of people who participated. I think it was less than 12 or around 12. To this day, almost 23 years later, people still quote this erroneous study about vaccines and autism. And it was one study. It was a single study conducted on 12 people, and the funding was messed up, and the people were manipulated into participating in a way, and it was very bad. And people still use that study to promote this anti-vax mythos that, there's this huge conspiracy to poison people with vaccines. Are there issues with vaccines? Of course there are. Do some people have allergic reactions to the ingredients? Yes. Do some people experience adverse whatever reactions and they can't get vaccinated? Yes, that's true. But like it was one study. And so what you have people doing is you have people going out there and they self-publish their own work, and then some kid, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You don't know any better. That's why you're a student. You're trying to learn. Finds this and they latch onto it and they say, well, even though this is the only source that I have, I believe in this so much, so I'm just going to amplify this. So this one paper written in the New Yorker, I'm going to amplify this. This one article off of Slate, I'm going to amplify this. These are opinion pieces that people write. These are not studies, So like if you're citing work, you need to cite peer-reviewed work. Peer-reviewed work. So I say all that to say this: don't send me no Slate articles. Don't send me no, New Yorker or the Times articles as your references. No, you send me a study as a reference, and then if you send me some poorly done study that's not peer reviewed, like this is why you have reference sections. So if I don't believe you, I'll look it up myself. You see what I'm talking about? Okay. Because some of you turned in your work and you didn't put any references or citations in your work, but we'll talk more about that later. This is a separate video from that. But anyways, yeah. So I say all that to say this: be careful of what you read. One study doesn't make a thing. You need multiple sources. You gotta have people kind of triangulate. They zoom in on it. They try to focus in on what's going on. But if whenever you see a study that says this proves that, just look at that with a little bit of skepticism.
Or what might contribute to somebody developing a disorder, right? So we have the definitions right up here. And then we have like the maintenance factors, like what is helping this psychopathology to continue, what is furthering these symptoms. And then we also have like protective factors, like what helps to guard against the development of psychopathology. So these are different factors that we look at when we think about psychopathology. We have risk factors, maintenance factors, and protective factors. So here's a practice problem for you. Okay, think about this for a second based on what we were talking about with risk, maintenance, and protective factors. So we have Susan currently meets criteria for a major depressive episode. Her close friends have begun to encourage her to seek counseling. So about a month ago, there was a breakup, and Susan began drinking alcohol regularly to relieve stress. So based on this information here, what would be a maintenance factor related to Susan's current depressive symptoms? So she's in the middle of a depressive episode. Her close friends are encouraging her to seek counseling. After there was a breakup with her partner about a month ago. So after this happened, she began to drink more regularly to try to relieve the stress. So what would be a maintenance factor? Is it going to be her breakup with her partner, her support network, her alcohol use, her stressful family life, or none of the above? What's the answer? All right, let's talk about it. It's going to be her alcohol use. So here's why. The alcohol use picked up after the breakup, right? So this would not be the risk factor that created her depressive episode. So her breakup with her partner is going to be a risk factor. So this happened, and then afterwards she became depressed. All right? Or it happened a month ago based from today. So within the last 30 days, she's had all these depressive symptoms, but they became noticeable after the breakup. So then we have her support network. This would be more like a protective factor because her friends are asking her to go get some help. And so then her therapist would become a member of her support network. Then we have her alcohol use. So this alcohol use is something that she's been doing more to try to relieve the stress. But alcohol is not a protective factor. No matter what anybody tells you, drinking more alcohol to feel better is not a protective factor. Doing drugs to feel better is not a protective factor. Abusing prescription medication to feel better is not a protective factor. These are going to be maintenance factors. These are going to be things that are helping to contribute to your maladaptive state, and we'll talk about more later when we get into substance abuse. Now, her stressful family life, we didn't really talk about her stressful family life. So this is something I want to introduce to you. This is a concept that I use in our quizzes and everything that we do here in class. So this is iClickers. This is on your 6 quizzes, your reading and discussion quizzes. This right here is a gobbledygook, right? D, option D, right? There's nothing in this question about her family life. So this is just thrown in there to trip you up, right? Disregard stuff like this. And then E, none of the above. This is the easy out. I like to throw these in because I don't want you to memorize things. I want you to think about things. All right. We are going to get into biological and genetic theories. So there's a misconception that biology causes psychological factors. So biology does not necessarily form the basis of or underlie psychological factors or cause psychological factors to exist or develop. Biology can actually be influenced by psychology. So we can think that some social and psychological factors can actually change our brain structures. You can think about things like motor imagery. When you think about doing something, how that can actually increase your ability to do it, right? You can think about things like hormones and neurotransmitters, how encountering stress in life can result in a rise in cortisol, and this can actually tax that system and lead to a cortisol imbalance. You can also think about biological functions can be influenced by psychology. Think about things like heart rate, which can be lowered through meditation. And also, when we're thinking about biological causes don't actually necessarily need biological treatment. So, for example, if you have like anxiety or an overactive physiological stress response system, maybe something with like relaxation can help you out, like CBT or different kinds of like progressive muscle relaxation. This can help you with this. So there are lots of effective treatments for reducing anxiety symptoms, which actually aren't biological in nature or medical in nature. Okay. So today, when we think about the causes of psychopathology, most psychologists view disorders as being caused by a variety of factors, but that can also be treated through a variety of factors. So a lot of times people try to reduce psychopathology solely to problems within the brain. It is inaccurate to do so. There is evidence that there is some kind of correlation between genetics and brain structure when it comes to psychopathology. But remember, correlation is not causation. Remember, we don't prove anything, we just find evidence in support of something. So it's inaccurate to say like, well, half of it's social factors and half of it's biological factors. It's not that simple, it's more complex. Talk about genetics. Just to let everybody know, I am not a geneticist. My least favorite topics are about genetics. So if you are interested in genetics, I would highly encourage you to look elsewhere and educate yourself with peer-reviewed studies. Let's talk about behavioral genetics.
And I really want to just second that point right there. Every semester I say this, and every semester I get somebody who is in some major that talks about genetics all the time, or in some other lab, and wants to ask me about CDGD, TDBDs, and all these crazy things I don't understand. And I don't understand them. And so I shouldn't have said crazy. Sorry about that. But like, these wild things, I don't understand these topics. I don't study them. I would be lying to you if I told you I did. So I have a small understanding of these kind of things, enough to just make it through this stuff when I'm talking with you, enough to help you understand it for the quiz. But if you want to get deep into the weeds, it ain't going to happen with me. And I'm sorry, but you know the best part about being in college is you have access to so much knowledge. And you wouldn't go to your engineering professor to ask them questions about molecular biology. So that's all I'm saying. So, you gotta find out the source, a trustworthy source, and get that information from them. This is not a genetics course. When we go over twin studies and all those other kind of things and genetic components, I know enough to get you through this course. I do not know enough to make you an expert in those topics. Just want to put that out there. All right, let's keep going.
Genetics. So this is going to be the study of how your genetics create dispositions for certain disorders, okay, and how these disorders are going to be studied. So behavior geneticists are actually interested in looking at how genes, the molecular unit of heredity, play a role, or what kind of role they play in the development of normal and abnormal behaviors. So behavioral genetics, this involves looking at how your gene and your environment interact to develop your behavior. So this is how researchers kind of look to see how behaviors are either inherited through your genes, and then they're also kind of interested in how your genes kind of like affect your behavior. Okay, we have this little gene, environment, behavior little cycle here, this little system. So one of the things that behavioral geneticists try to look at these different kinds of questions. What's the role of genetics in causing a particular mental disorder? What behavior or what aspects of behavior are influenced by genes? Not just genes, but like what role does environment play in behavior? And what is the role of interactions between genes and the environment? So this is also known as a gene by environment interaction, G by E, nature versus nurture. This is how, like, what environmental factors interact with the genetic factors to contribute to our behaviors. So when we think about these questions, this is like the nature versus nurture debate. If you inherit a personality that is highly neurotic, you might be more likely to have thoughts that are associated with depression and anxiety. So, and this might lead to different kinds of responses to things that involve in your environment, which might contribute to a certain kind of behavior. And then later on, we'll talk about other things like epigenetics and how this behavior might actually influence your genes. Okay, so when we think about the nurture side, we think about the environment and how that certain environment might trigger or activate certain behavioral characteristics or psychological characteristics. Okay. So when we think about personality, we want to look at how personality is both influenced by genetics, but is also influenced by environments as well. Alrighty. So here's...
And that's like, this reminds me of, people will say that I look just like my dad. I'm not going to put a picture of my dad up on the screen, so don't worry about it. You don't have to look at that stuff. People say, hey, Walter, you look just like your dad, and a lot of that is genetics. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, I am a combination of my mother and my father. And so the fact that I look similar to my father is a good thing. So no Maury Povich episodes over here. But there's also the way I behave, the way that I talk, the way that I sound, and some of the mannerisms that I have. And people might say, man, Walter, when I heard you talk, and then I heard your father talk, I was like, man, I like the same person. Then I see your mannerisms, see the way you behave. You're very similar to your father in behavior. Now, could that be genetic? Sure. I mean, I am half my father, half my mother, genetically. So you could make an argument that my behaviors would be half my mother and half my father. But also, I was raised in a house with my mother and my father. So I learned how to speak by listening to my mother and my father talk. I learned how to behave and respond to situations by looking at how my mother and my father respond in these situations. So it could be genes, it could be environment. It's probably a mixture of both. So it's very complex. And where is that that edge? Like, where does it cross over from genes? Where does it cross over from environment? You got to do some other studies to test that out. We'll talk about that later. But once again, If you're coming to me for genes, my name ain't Levi.
Some definitions on different parts of your gene. So this is very basic background information. If you're interested, I would definitely encourage you to research more. So you have your genotype, and this is going to be your genetic makeup or profile, and this is pretty much fixed at birth, and you inherit this for your parent. Then you have your phenotype, and this is going to be like the observable traits, like your weight, eye color, and the phenotype might be influenced both by your genotype and your environmental experiences. This could be in a gene by environment feedback loop. Biology and genetics are not the same thing. They're not identical, so there's a lot in common, but this is not the same thing. So for example, a biological cause for disorder is not a genetic cause for disorder. So an example of this would be if you get hit in the head or you have a brain injury, right? And this changes who you are, right? This brain injury is not a genetic defect. This brain injury is physiological damage that affects the way your brain functions, but this physiological damage is not a genetic defect. It's important to understand that, genes are not sufficient to account for the development of any psychological disorder. So even though we might find similarities between different disorders, genetic similarities between different disorders or within a disorder, doesn't mean that we have a genetic test where I can then send off some saliva to 23andMe and then figure out what disorder I have. Now, we might find risks or we might find associations involved, but there's no genetic test for a particular disorder. So let's move on talking about gene by environment interactions. Okay. Now, when we think about gene environment interactions, genes and environments are not randomly put together. Environments and genes are often likely to come in particular pairs at more than chance levels. So let me give you an example of this. So keep in mind that genetic factors can influence the kinds of environments we choose, which might reinforce our genetically influenced personalities and interests. So let me give you some examples of this. We have people with identical genes who might have similar temperaments, and they might have similar talents, and this might cause them to choose similar environments. So let's say if I have children who have tendencies towards aggression and impulsive behavior. Now, aggression and impulsive behavior are both seen as being influenced by genetic factors. I say influence, okay. So this might mean that these children could choose friends or be more susceptible to choosing friends that encourage these type of behaviors, which might provide more opportunities for them to engage in antisocial acts. So the environment itself might actually work towards bringing out a genetic tendency. So there's going to be some more information about this a little bit later. And then we have something called epigenetics, where the environment actually influences or impacts your genetic expression. So epigenetics would be this is about how the environmental conditions affect the expression of your genes. So you have DNA that can be chemically modified by different environmental conditions, resulting in genes being turned on or being turned off. And as a result of this, cells, tissues, and organs might be altered in their development. So there was actually a study that was looking at the effects of epigenetic processes on stress response in rats. So you have mother rats, they typically lick and groom their infants. These infant rats are called pups. But the amount of licking varies from one mother to another. So babies who are licked and groomed more tend to grow into adults that are less fearful and show more modest physiological responses to stress compared with pups that are licked and groomed less. So researchers found that when the biological offspring of mothers that groom less were raised by mothers who groomed more, they are less fearful, reactive to stress than they are when they're raised by their own mothers. And when the biological offspring of mothers who lick and groom more are raised by mothers who lick and groom less, they are more fearful and physiologically reactive to stress than when they are raised by their own mothers. So this pattern suggests that the mother's behavior influences the development of the pup's reaction to stress. The amount that the mother rats lick and groom pups in the first week of life affects the release of certain hormones in the baby. So a specific mechanism in the body is being affected by this behavior, which changes responses to stress. So these hormones, in effect, turn off the expressions of a gene or affect the expressions of a gene that influences the development of the hippocampus. So this is the area of the brain that influences the stress response. So the mother's behavior towards the baby during the first week of life will affect the expression of these key genes, changing the development of an area of the brain, and in turn influencing the pup's behavioral and physiological responses to stress later on. Now, these epigenetic responses, or processes I should say, might explain how identical twins that share DNA could differ in their expression of a particular disorder. So both twins might carry identical genes, but if the environments of the twins differ during fetal development or in different critical stages of development after birth, their expression of certain genes may differ, leading one twin but not the other to develop a disorder. So
So that was a whole lot of information, a whole lot of content. You can look up Meanie 2010 if you are interested in learning more about that. I honestly believe that I deserve an award for explaining that. But anyways, I'm not going to get one. But, the most disturbing thing about that whole study is that I learned there that baby rats are called pups, not my pupper. That's not what. So next time someone asks you if you want some pups, make sure you make them, make sure they're a little more specific, I don't know. I'm going to get canceled on Twitter by the rat crowd. I already know.
Illustration here of a gene by environment interaction. On the x-axis, we have the extent of someone's maltreatment. On the y-axis, we have probability of depression. The first is there's no maltreatment. The second one is probable maltreatment, and the third one is severe maltreatment. What you're going to look at here, the different alleles. We have like the short alleles and the long alleles, right? So this has to do with the stress response, okay? So if you have short alleles, you're going to have an increased stress response, and if you have long alleles, you're going to have a decreased stress response. So when looking at this chart, those with the highest stress response are going to have the two short alleles, then one short, one long, and then two long are going to be the lowest stress responses. So right over here, we can see that without any maltreatment or with a low probability of maltreatment, we actually have a low probability of depression. Then as we move to a probable amount of maltreatment, we see that with the long alleles, we have the same probability of depression. With one short, we have an increased probability, and then with two short, we're going to have the highest probability. And then we go over to severe. So right here, we have the same risk of depression or probability of depression with long alleles. Then we have an increased probability of depression with a short long, and then with two short, we're going to have the highest risk of developing depression. So this is an example of a gene by environment interaction, where we have these different environments interacting with different genes to create different outcomes. We're going to talk about some incorrect assumptions when it comes to genetics. The first incorrect assumption that we're going to talk about is if there's a genetic influence, the disorder is inevitable. This is actually wrong. It's a better way to think about this is environmental factors are often necessary to trigger the expression of genes. So the genes alone do not cause a vast majority of emotional disorders. So genes might actually predispose someone towards developing a mental disorder, but the problem is going to emerge only when the predisposition is combined with psychological and social stressors. Remember, talk about with the diathesis stress model, you could have a diathesis but never encounter a sufficient stress to activate that disorder. So number 2 is if a behavior or characteristic is genetically influenced, it cannot be changed. This is not true. Some individuals have genetic predispositions, but they're still able to change. So you want to think about this with like, let's say if you have a genetic predisposition to an intellectual disability, there are certain environmental experiences, either diet or early stimulation, that can increase an individual's IQ or decrease the problems that someone might develop later on. So
yeah, that's a very important point to talk about. So the younger you are, you have a lot more neuroplasticity, so you can learn things easier. You can form neural pathways easier. This is why they say that it's best to teach a child multiple languages when they're younger rather than when they're older. So right now, I'm 37 years old, RIP. And if I want to learn another language, I probably could, but I'm not multilingual. I mean, unless you count like AAVE as a second language, but I'm not really multilingual. It'd be difficult for me to learn a second language. However, if you're like 18, 19 years old, level neuroplasticity is a little bit higher than mine. You can probably learn a language, especially if you already learned one before. So if you go back even further and you're like 5, 6 years old, you can probably easily pick up another language. And then you're just going to be, at a better advantage, and that helps you out. So this is why, prenatal nutrition is important. This is why when a child is super young, it's important that you get the right kind of food. So this is why there's a lot of conversations about this in other classes, but there's a lot of social and cultural factors that limit an individual's development physiologically. And of course, there's a lot of social and cultural factors that just limit people no matter what their aptitude is. And so I might get into some of that a little bit later in the semester. I'm not going to get into it right now, but IQ is very culturally biased because I used to administer IQ tests, and some of that information I didn't even know. Does that mean I'm a dummy? No, I'm a PhD student, for crying out loud. So there's a lot of conversations we can have about this, but we're not going to have them right now. But I did want to put out there that what I'm talking about is, if you receive a lot of good nutrition at a very young age, if you receive a lot of educational opportunities at a very young age, your trajectory in life is going to be a lot higher. And then, of course, you'll be measured higher in things like IQ, which is what is currently used to measure intelligence. But that's starting to change. People are getting rid of the GRE, people are getting rid of the SAT and other entrance exams for a lot of reasons that we probably won't get into in this class, but you can edify yourself.
You can have an early enough intervention to reduce the magnitude of the impairment caused by the intellectual disability. If there is a genetic influence, a gene must be directly responsible for the behavior. So I'm going to introduce you to a term called polygenic. Behaviors are usually polygenic in nature, and so this means that they are influenced by more than one gene. So there's a general understanding that there's no single gene that potentiates a mental disorder. So there's no schizophrenia gene, there's no alcoholism gene, there's no depression gene. So you can't, like I said, you can't just spit into a tube, send it off to some lab, and they're like, oh, there, you have depression. You see? Okay. Where we talk about twin studies and family incident studies. So we have 3 approaches to studying behavioral genetics. We have family incident studies, twin studies, and adoption studies. So with family incident studies, what we're asking is, do disorders run in families? So if a father has a substance use disorder, do his children develop substance use disorders? So answering yes to this question might suggest a genetic influence, but is often more complicated than that. So we're going to go over some examples of this.
I just want to pause for a second and just marvel at the change in the production values of these videos. I mean, yeah, this is a huge difference. Look at that. The video is cutting out. The audio's popping. I don't even know how this audio sounds. Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe. Ring that bell for notifications. But yeah, this is... I just want to pause. And, you kids have it good. My last class, they had to watch lecture in the snow, uphill both ways.
Looking at family incidence studies, if someone in the family has disorder, we want to look at what the relative risk is for them or their family members having various disorders, right? So researchers first identify a proband, and this is going to be the first person in the family who is affected by a disorder that seeks medical attention. That's going to be the proband. So the proband is compared to their family members, and then researchers are going to examine the proportion of family members that suffer from different disorders relative to this person. Okay? So in the question we were talking about before with a father with substance use disorder, the father is going to be the proband. We want to know what the relative risk is that their family members will also have this disorder or other disorders. Now, one issue, there's a confound between the influence of genes and environment. Although they tend to share genes, they also tend to share environments as well. It's hard to tell whether a higher prevalence of illness in a family is due to a proband and some kind of genetic causation or due to an environmental causation. So this means that we don't know what percentage the genes environment overlap. So for example, I might say like a father has substance use disorder and people with the same dad have similar genes, but they also might live in the same household, so they have similar environments. So it's unclear if there's an alcoholism gene or if growing up in the home with an alcoholic father or alcoholic parent is what really sets you up. It's hard to do, like, to disentangle that gene by environment interaction. So family incidence studies, if we have family members that are at a higher risk of developing this or other disorder, whatever disorder of interest we're looking at, we kind of can conclude one of two things. Either there is some genetic aspects that's contributing to development of the disorder, or some kind of environmental aspect that is tied to this disorder based on the shared environment. So we can assume either there's some genetics or some family environment, but we don't know which one's stronger than the other, and we don't know to what extent that strength contributes to the disorder. Here is going to be a data set that we're going to look at, and this is going to be a practice. So right here, we see that we have a column that says proband. This proband column contains A, B, and C. So A, B, and C, these are all individuals. Remember, the proband is the first individual in a family that seeks medical treatment for a particular disorder, right? So we have A, B, and C. These are different people, right? Then we have the diagnosis column. So we have MDD, which is major depressive disorder. We have schizophrenia, and we have no diagnosis. Then we have the percentage of family with major depressive disorder and the percentage of family with schizophrenia. So what we're doing here is we are comparing the proband to the no diagnosis person. That's what we are doing. So the proband with MDD is going to be compared to the proband with no diagnosis. Same thing with schizophrenia, right? All right. So based on this data set, take a look at it. And what's the correct answer? If the proband has schizophrenia, which of the following is true? So which row are we looking at? Which proband are we looking at? Okay? All right. So is it A, family members have a greater risk of having MDD compared to no diagnosis? Family members have a greater risk of having schizophrenia compared to no diagnosis. Both A and B. Family members have the same relative risk as those who have no diagnosis. And there is not enough information to decide. So take a look at here. All right, pause it. Think about it for a second. All right, let's talk about it. So what we are doing in this question is we are comparing schizophrenia to no diagnosis. We're at proband B comparing to proband C. So if we have schizophrenia, and I look at the percentage of family members with major depressive disorder, right? We see the comparison there is 12 in the schizophrenia and 10 with no diagnosis, right? Now let's look at the percent of family with schizophrenia. I see that with proband B, the risk is, or the percentage is 30%, and with no diagnosis, the risk is 0.5%. So what were my choices again? My choices were, if the proband of schizophrenia, which of the following is true? Family members have a greater risk of having MDD compared to no diagnosis. Family members have a greater risk of having schizophrenia compared to no diagnosis. What would be the correct answer? It'd be both A and B. Because as you say, I said greater. So anything above 10 is greater. So the correct answer would be C, both A and B. You have a greater risk for major depressive disorder and a greater risk for schizophrenia. Now, if that confuses you, don't worry. This isn't the last time we're going to see this. But come to office hours, send me an email.
So this is going to be very important. While you're watching these videos, make sure you're doing these practice questions. Like, actually try to do these practice questions. You'll thank me later. Okay? I received the first batch of participation points. Got a bunch of 5s. Congratulations. Because you watched the lecture, you answered the questions. Then I got a bunch of 2s, 1s, and 0s. Well, some of those 0s because people didn't do them. But it's like, make sure that you're doing the participation points while you're watching these lectures. They're participation points for participating. So, listen to the lecture, watch it, have your iClickers or your participation point quiz open, or do it later, do it right after, whatever. Or you'll just pay attention. You see what I'm talking about? Also, I know a bunch of people, this is totally unrelated, a bunch of people had started their their participation quizzes, and they did not submit them. You have to submit them. Make sure you finish them. They're due on Fridays at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. So I'm in Illinois. I don't know where you are, but I'm on Central Standard Time. So make sure you're submitting them. Yeah. And that's all I got to say about that. All right.
Second approach is going to be twin studies. Twin studies look at concordance rates. All right, so let's talk about concordance rates. So concordance rates are going to be the agreement within a twin pair, right? So if one twin has depression and the other twin has depression, that's going to be that's concordance, right? That's an agreement. So I have 100 twins with depression, then 60% of their corresponding twins also have depression. That's going to be a concordance rate of 60%. Okay, so the key comparison with twin studies is going to be comparing the concordance rate of monozygotic twins to dizygotic twins. So particularly what we want to see is if monozygotic twins have a higher likelihood than dizygotic twins, right? Because with monozygotic twins, you have identical twins that share 100% genetic material because they come from the same egg. And then we have dizygotic twins. These are fraternal twins that share 50% of genetic information like any other sibling pair. And the reason why we look at twins is because twins are usually within the same family, usually in the same age, and have similar experiences. All right. So when we're looking at these twin pairs, these studies are particularly helpful in trying to look at the genetic component of particular disorders. Okay, so let's take a look right here. If I have the concordance rate in monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, this supports a genetic influence when it comes to whatever disorder I'm looking at, right? So this would be like the results in the perfect case would be like there's a 100% concordance rate in monozygotic twins and like 50% concordance rates in dizygotic twins. So this shows a genetic influence. So then we have a monozygotic twins being equal to dizygotic twins, and both of them are high. The concordance rate are both high, right? So I have monozygotic twins, concordance rate 100%, dizygotic twins, the concordance rate 100%, right? Or like super high, right? I'm like, okay, this is due to a shared environment, right? Okay. Because the rates are high, they're both roughly equivalent, which means that this is probably not something due to genetics, this is probably due to the shared environment. So now let's look at something different. Let's say we have the concordance rate is equivalent, roughly equivalent between monozygotic and dizygotic twins, so about 0%, right? Both of the concordance rates are really low, which means this is probably due to a non-shared environment. So this means that this is due to the individual experiences the twins are having, okay? So, like we were talking about earlier, if you're an identical twin, it's likely that your environment is going to be very similar. Your life experience is going to be very similar when compared to your twin, right? Especially at a young age. Because identical twins are treated more alike than fraternal twins. So to account for this, researchers use adoption studies. Now, what this means is they research twin pairs that have been adopted to different families. This does not mean that researchers go out to adoption agencies and say, okay, separate these twins, separate those twins. They reach out to adoption agencies to identify twins that have been raised in different households, and then you collect data from that, okay? So the most common way that this is set up is...
Yeah, I just want to pause it real quick and say that adoption is rugged. Like literally people will go to adoption agencies, see a set of twins, and they will adopt one of the twins. They will literally separate twins, little baby twins. It's ridiculous to me. Like this is a thing that happens. Like who are you? Who are these people? Like what's their story? If you know, let me know in the comments below. Send me an email. Tell me these stories. Like who's going to an adoption agency? It's like, oh, look at these babies. They're so cute. I'll take one. You know, that's ridiculous. But this is happening. This actually happens. People go out and they'll adopt a baby, like a single baby out of like a twin pair or something like that. See, that's wild. You know what I'm talking about? That's out of control. Like for me to think about. That's yeah, like I don't even know what's happening here. Also though, you're doing the same thing when you go to a kennel and you grab one puppy out the litter. That's what you're doing. You're separating that puppy from its siblings. That's what you're doing. Just want to put that out there. Okay. All right, let's go back to the video.
Separate these twins, separate those twins. They reach out to adoption agencies to identify twins that have been raised in different households, and then you collect data from that, okay? So the most common way that this is set up is you first identify individuals who have the disorder of interest, and then you double check to see if they were adopted shortly after birth to reduce the likelihood of environmental effects. Now, what you do is you look at the concordance rate of the disorder between like biological relatives and adopted relatives to see which is higher. So the biological relatives you're usually looking at are like their biological parents, okay? And then the adoptive parents. So if a disorder is strongly influenced by genetics, researchers should see higher concordance rate of the disorder among the biological relatives of the adoptee as opposed to the adoptive relatives. If the disorder is strongly influenced by environment, you should see higher rates of the disorder among the adoptive relatives than the biological relatives. So the best variant of this type of study is using monozygotic twins, namely those who have been raised apart, because their genetic material is completely controlled for. So with dizygotic twins, remember there's a 50% overlap. With monozygotic twins, there is 100% genetic overlap. So if you have identical twins separated at birth, then it's going to be better for you, better results. All right, this is going to be another question for us. Let's practice. All righty, so let's say I have adoptees with disorder X. So these are twins with disorder X. And then I have adoptees without disorder X, twins without disorder X. All right. So if the parents have the same disorder as the twins, like that percentage is 20%, then we have their adoptive parents with disorder X at 10%, right? So their biological parents have a higher rate of disorder. The adoptive parents have a lower rate of disorder. We look at adoptees without the disorder. The percent of parents with the disorder is equivalent to percent of adoptive parents without a disorder. So what does this actually mean? All right, so pause the video, think about that for a second. What does it mean? Look at the options. Which of the options would be true? If an adoptee has a disorder, their adoptive parents are more likely than their biological parents have the disorder. If an adoptee has a disorder, their biological parents are more likely than their adoptive parents have the disorder. C, disorders are not caused by environmental contributions. D, disorders are solely caused by biological contributions. E, there's not enough information to decide. So go ahead and press pause, think about it for a second. All right, so unpause the video, think about it for a second. You have an answer? There we go. Answer is going to be B. If an adoptee has a disorder, their biological parents are more likely than their adoptive parents to have the disorder. So based on the information provided, this is the only conclusion you can reasonably come to. So now we're looking at genetic studies, twin studies, adoption studies. Remember, it's very important to understand that these studies are useful for observing heritability of behaviors and disorders, but they do not identify which specific genes are involved. Is there a genetic test for psychopathology? Can I identify a depression gene? Can I identify an alcoholic gene? No. Okay? Now remember, it is likely that there are multiple genes, right? There are multiple genes that respond to a wide range of environmental factors to lead to a disorder. Okay? Most disorders are not associated with a single abnormal gene. They're polygenic in nature, so there's probably multiple abnormal genes. And then each of these altered genes might only contribute a partial bit of vulnerability to the disorder. Some might contribute more than others. So when these genes come together, when there's like a certain number of these genes that combine, the individual might be at a greater risk for developing a disorder. Now remember, this is a multi-gene process. This is a polygenetic process. It takes multiple genetic abnormalities coming together within one individual to create a specific disorder. So once again, there is no single gene. Okay? So now we're going to get into classification psychopathology. So now we're going to pause right there. So just remember, if you have questions about genes, make sure you're looking it up. Make sure you're checking out the search.progress.com, looking in DSM-5. When it comes to genes, all I know is YMH. Make sure you're following Proto. Keep it high and tight, and you better believe your grades are coming out in May. All right, everybody, let's look at how scientists, researchers develop classification and how clinicians use classification. So starting with this, we're going to get into our agenda. We're going to talk about what is classification. We're going to talk about categorical versus dimensional. We'll talk about the threshold model. And we're talking about the DSM-5, reliability and validity. And we're also going to have a discussion about the limitations of the DSM-5. Okay. So let's talk about classification. What is classification? So classification is basically organizing and subdividing a set of related objects. So we can think about the classification systems that we use for animals, numbers, historical periods, etc. So let's look at things like animals. We have classification systems for animals. We have like mammals, reptiles, amphibians. We say, let's think about music. We have classification systems for music. We have like classical music, popular music, hip hop, things like that. Okay. So now let's go into a classification system. Like what are the benefits of a classification system? A classification system gives you a shared scientific language to talk about diagnosing psychological disorders. This is going to help you to facilitate description in a more efficient manner. It's going to help us with treatment decisions. Not only does this help me with treatment decisions, but it also helps me in looking at future outcomes for clients. This also helps me to look at the causes so I can make more interventions, so I can identify where in a person's life or in their circumstances where something might develop. I can intervene. So this is why when you go to college, you receive a lot of interventions about drug and alcohol use, because a lot of people's drug and alcohol use really picks up in college. And some people it starts earlier, but a lot of people it starts in college. All right. But also, this facilitates our research endeavors, the development of the DSM-5 and these different kinds of treatment manuals, and it also gives us the ability to get third-party reimbursement. When you see third-party reimbursement, what does that mean? Insurance companies. But that's a whole nother conversation to have in some other class, right? People who are in the profession of actually treating people, these treatments to be provided for individuals, you want them to be able to receive treatment. So that's what a shared scientific language allows for you to do. So now let's talk about some of the concerns with this classification system. All right, so the diagnostic bias is, this is where I just overdiagnose people, right? This means that I am partial to a certain diagnosis. Maybe I'm partial to giving certain groups of people a particular diagnosis, right? Like I'm going to misinterpret different behaviors as being abnormal or maladaptive. There's going to be actually a really good example of this in a video in the next slide, but this is like, if I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, I'm just going to assign all these black men schizophrenia. I'm going to assign all these women depression because, black people are schizophrenic, women are depressed. You see what I'm talking about? Like those internal biases people have. Then we have stigmatization or marginalization. So if I give somebody a diagnosis, this is a label that I'm applying to somebody, and depending on where society is, this might influence how other people view and treat the person. This might change how the patient themselves behaves or feels about themselves. This might lead an individual to blame themselves or not seek treatment. And then this can also make symptoms of the disorder worse. So then we have unrelated problems that might be misattributed to the diagnosis. So for example, let's talk about depression, right? So let's say if I'm depressed, I received the label of being a depressed individual. So now I'm going around and I can't get a job. Well, you can't get a job because you're depressed. Maybe, I can't find a spouse. Or you can't find a spouse because you're depressed. Maybe, I like Depeche Mode. Well, you like Depeche Mode because you're depressed. Maybe, or maybe they're not related. And I'm just, now that I have this bucket of depression, I'm just throwing everything that's going on with someone's life into depression. Okay. And then we have misclassification. This is where I interpret symptoms incorrectly. This is where there's different symptoms that exist in different disorders. Maybe I'm just misdiagnosing you with the wrong disorder, right? So maybe you have substance use. So there are instances where you have an individual who might have substance use, but they also have underlying trauma, underlying depression, anxieties with life that cause these issues. But I focus in too quickly on the primary concern, alcohol and drug abuse. And I don't try to help somebody with the other diagnoses that they might have. All right, so right here we're going to have a video.
A different kind of criticism, just as provocative, has been leveled by David Rosenhan of Stanford University.
Between 1969 and 1972, a group of colleagues and I gained admission to psychiatric hospitals by faking a single symptom, which was that we said that we heard voices, and the voices said, empty, dull, thud. The moment we were admitted to the hospital, we abandoned our symptom, and we behaved the way we usually behave. The question was, would anyone detect that we were sane? The answer was, no. No one ever did. Admitted with the diagnosis in the main of paranoid schizophrenia, we were discharged with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in remission. Now, in remission doesn't mean quite the same thing as sane. The term we use to describe the experience is dehumanized. Nobody talks to you. Nobody has any contact with you. The average contact of patients with staff was about 6.5 minutes a day. Nobody comes to visit. The first time I was in a psychiatric hospital, on an admissions ward with 41 men, my wife constituted 4 of the 7 visitors on a weekend. Psychiatric hospitals are storehouses for people in society whom you really don't want, whom you really don't understand, and for whom you've lost a great deal of sympathy. Staff need constantly to be reminded, and it's very hard to remind them. They are, after all, doing their best on the front end, but they need constantly to be reminded that the people who are their charges are not merely collections of symptoms. They are people with spouses, with children, with parents, with jobs, with mortgages and bills to pay, that they are, in the fullest sense of the word, very human and very unhappy.
Alright, so that video is from the Rosenhan study, very well-known study. Oh, I have links to those articles if you're interested in that. Send me an email and I'll give it to you. Alright, so let's play a little game. We're going to do classification systems. So I'm going to show you some objects, and I want you to tell me what the items all have in common. So these items, what do these items all have in common? There we go. They're all red. How about these items right here? What do these items have in common? That's right. They're both made from carbon. And right here, what do these items have in common? That's right. These are all cardiovascular diseases, stroke and heart attack. All right. Now our current diagnostic system primarily focuses on the appearance of disorders through signs and symptoms. So let's look at categories versus dimensions. So right over here, a categorical approach is going to look at the difference in kind or quality. So right here, when it comes, this image is apples and oranges. So these are fruit, and apples and oranges are different kinds of fruit, right? And then even within apples and oranges, I might be able to rate the quality of the apple or the quality of the orange. Like, how good is it? Then we have the dimensional approach, and this focuses on the amount of a characteristic that an object possesses. So for example, height. Now, maybe in my mind, I think of a good height or a bad height or a kind of height, but really height it's a dimension. I have an amount of it. 5'8", 5'9", 6 feet. This is the amount that I have. Okay, so when we're thinking about symptoms along a dimension, we're thinking about the amount that we have. So right over here, this is a categorical approach for depression, right? So I have this group of normal people who aren't depressed, and then all of a sudden they cross this line and now they are depressed. So there's some way that these people, right, are different. There's a qualitative difference between people who are depressed and not depressed, right? We can think about this with depression even further through quantitatively as well, right? So I can even collect data, but I still have individuals put into discrete categorical groups of depressed or not depressed. So I have like 35% depressed people, 65% not depressed people, right? This is still categorical in nature. I can go further and I can create a dimensional approach. So this is where I'm collecting the quantitative data. So right over here, you can exist along a continuum of depression, where you are not at all depressed, mildly depressed, and very depressed. So you can exist anywhere along this line, along this dimension. But within that dimension, you might have different categories that I could place there. So who has seen this before? What is this called? Yes, this is a Likert scale, named after Rensis Likert. It's also known as a rating scale. It's important to understand that all Likert scales are rating scales, but not all rating scales are Likert scale. A Likert scale is specifically a 5-point scale. Other people have expanded this to go anywhere from 0 to 5, 0 to 7, all the way up to 0 to 100, or whatever they want to do. So this is a dimensional approach. We have the threshold approach. So let me explain what the threshold approach is. So right here, what we've decided is that we're asking you how depressed you feel. So not at all, mildly, very depressed. But if you look, there's actually a point where you go from being not depressed to depressed, and we create a cutoff. So once you get past this certain score, you will be categorized as depressed. So this combines both the categorical approach and the dimensional approach. So here, what you have is you have an individual. If they score a 2 or higher, they will be considered to be depressed. And then within that, you might have those different levels of depression. But if you are below 2, even though you have depressive symptoms, you would not be categorized as being depressed. Alright, so for the DSM-5, the primary goal in using the DSM-5 is going to be making sure that it is going to be easily usable by clinicians to give an accurate diagnosis of a particular disorder. So researchers want to make sure that it is reliable, that there's a strong reliability and also strong validity of the diagnoses in the DSM-5. Okay? So reliability is going to be the consistency of measurements, including diagnostic decisions. So the DSM-5 as a system is reliable if mental disorders and categories are consistent and can be agreed upon across different clinicians. So more often in psychology, we actually talk about like the reliability of a particular diagnosis, like whether or not this person has MDD. Will another clinician give like a second opinion and come to the same result? So this kind of reliability here, this one like between two different clinicians, this is known as inter-rater reliability. So this is going to be the agreement of raters. Are these two different clinicians coming to the same diagnosis? So with reliability, we are interested in whether a measurement can consistently produce the same results. Now, there are some problems when it comes to reliability for particular diagnoses in DSM-5. There's unclear criteria. So, for example, in the DSM-4, the phrase "a significant portion of the illness" was used a lot. So, like, what counts as a significant portion of the illness? 30%, 40%, 50%? No one knows. There's also a large overlap between disorders when it comes to symptoms, right? So this isn't just like comorbidity. This is like the shared symptoms. So like major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, it's less reliable in diagnosing these because these symptoms overlap with one another. Well, let's move on to talking about validity. All right. So not only do we look at reliability, we also want to look at validity. So is the DSM-5 actually measuring what we are saying it's measuring? So if I say I'm capturing data on depression, am I actually measuring depression or I'm measuring something else? So this would be similar to thinking about, in order for a quiz to be valid, it must measure what you have learned and retained from class. If it measures what you have learned and retained from class, this could be valid quiz. Now, I could give you a reliable quiz. I could have you write your name on a piece of paper, and that would be consistent no matter how many times I gave you that quiz, because you're probably going to write your name on the piece of paper the same every time. Like, it's going to be the same name because that's your name. But it's not valid because this quiz is just gathering your name. It's not gathering whether or not you retained information from class. So it's a reliable test because the results are the same, but it's not valid because I'm not measuring the right things. So right here, here's a nice little chart talking more about reliability and validity, right? So the bullseye is the diagnosis. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have unreliable and unvalid. So this right here, every time I give the test or I give the diagnosis, I'm getting different results, right? So I have this little measurement that I'm using to measure depression, but every time I fill it out or give it to different people, it's totally different. It's way off the mark. It's not measuring depression, and the results are always different, right? Now the next one, move straight down, we have something that's reliable but not valid. So when I give this measure, I'm getting the results. They're around the same, right? There's a little bit of variance there, but it's not measuring what I want to measure. And then I can move down and look at the reliability and validity. This is where I want the DSM-5 to be. I want it to be both reliable and valid. All right, so there's two kinds of validity that we're looking at here. The first one we'll talk about is ideological validity. Now, etiology is a cause of particular disorder, the study of the causes of disorders. So for something to be etiologically valid, that means it's causally valid. So this is causal validity. So this is going to be concerned with making sure, the causal validity is concerned with specific factors that are regularly and uniquely associated with a particular disorder. So we want to make sure if this specific factor causes a disorder. So this is causal validity. We have two groups of disorders and their accompanying causes, right? So we have the column on the left is the causes, and the column on the right are the disorders. So we have classification system 1, which is A, classification system 2, which is B. So cause A leads to the disorder A1, cause B leads to the disorder B1, and so forth, right? So look at the top classification system and look at the bottom classification system. Which one of these has good causal validity? Classification system 1. That's good causal validity because I have cause A, and I know that every time cause A would lead to disorder 2. Now look at classification system 2. Look, cause A leads to disorder A and B, and then cause D leads to order A and D. It's a mess. So system number 2 would not have good etiological validity, would not have good causal validity. And then we have predictive validity. We want to make sure, is this classification system good at predicting future treatment outcomes, course of the illness more broadly? So what will the specific disorder predict in the future? What's going to happen? So if I have a substance use disorder, what's the risk for suicide? What's the risk for health issues? What's the risk for depression? Like if I diagnose you, am I able to predict what might happen to you? And so this is an important part of the DSM-5 because we want to see what might happen prospectively, so that way we can have those interventions and those treatments to avoid that happening in the future. And this is going to be some quick review, just summarizing reliability and validity. So remember, validity is going to be the degree to which something measures what it is supposed to measure. This is not the same thing as reliability, because remember, reliability is going to be the extent to which a measurement gives results that are consistent. You must have reliability in order to have validity. Let's talk about the limitations to the DSM-5. So remember, although the DSM-5 is very helpful, there are limitations associated with this classification system. So there's often arbitrary boundaries between what is considered normal and abnormal and what counts as a symptom or diagnosis. These boundaries come in the form of symptom cutoffs that are not always empirically justified for disorders. So this could be like, you must have 5 symptoms from a list or 3 symptoms from a list. So like for depression, you need 5 symptoms, but someone with 4 symptoms, are they really that different from someone with 5 symptoms? So if I have 4 depressive symptoms, am I so much better, feeling better subjectively than someone who has like 5 depressive symptoms? There's going to be a lot of reliance on phrases that carry some kind of subjective judgment on the part of the clinician. So when I say significant distress and significant impairment, what does this mean? This can be interpreted differently across clinicians. It's up for the clinician to decide what is significant based on what the client tells them. So let's think about schizoaffective disorder. This is basically schizophrenia with the presence of like persistent mood symptoms. And in the DSM-4, it depended on the clinician's interpretation of whether their mood symptoms were present for a significant portion of the illness. So in order to differentiate this disorder from a mood disorder with psychotic features, that differentiation might be hard to come up with. This has been improved in the DSM-5, but when it comes to like schizoaffective disorder, the reliability is actually still lower than ideal. The DSM-5 also relies on time periods. Now, so these time periods are required for the manifestation of symptoms. So let's say if you have a major depressive symptoms that lasts 1 day less than the 2-week threshold, you technically don't qualify for the diagnosis, but if I have 14 days of depressive symptoms, if I compare it to somebody with 13 days of depressive symptoms, like what's really the difference there? What's the difference between having depressive symptoms for 13 days versus 14 days for the individual? So these cutoffs, these discrete cutoffs can be very, very limiting. All right, so then also we have a lot of problems with comorbidity in the DSM-5. So you'll have 56% of people who meet criteria for one disorder.
I want to pause right here real quick. So I know we're talking a lot about critiques of the DSM-5 and a lot of limitations, and that's fine. It's okay to critique the DSM-5, but we are going to be following the DSM-5 diagnosis for our quizzes and tests. I only say that because every semester I have somebody who is offended that their clinical psychology course is following the DSM-5. And which is fine to critique the DSM-5, but we are going to follow the DSM-5. We're not following crystaltherapy.com. If we don't like the DSM-5, then we try to improve the DSM-5. We have like the DSM-1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're on the 5th version. So there will be a DSM-6. Maybe you can join the fight. Maybe you can join psychology and improve the DSMs for the 6th revision. But that's my little statement right there, just to stave off any of the why are we following the DSM-5 in this course.
Disorder also meet criteria for another disorder. This is a problem because it kind of makes you wonder: are we measuring the things that we're saying we are measuring? This affects the validity of our system, but it also affects the reliability of our system. Let me give you an example of this. So right here, let's say that so I'm a clinician, right? And I'm measuring someone to see what they have. So right here, I have symptoms of depression and symptoms of anxiety. So of course, everybody loves Venn diagrams. There's depression symptoms that are unique to depression, and then there are anxiety symptoms that are unique to anxiety. But look at these symptoms in the middle. These are these comorbid symptoms that occur between both disorders. So if I'm a clinician, I might detect, all those symptoms in the middle, and maybe a few on each side, but maybe I come up with that this person has depression. Another clinician, except that they have anxiety, and I try to treat them 2 different ways, But what does the person have? Do they have anxiety? Do they have depression? I don't know. Do they have both? I don't know. It kind of makes it difficult, especially if you just go to one person. And most people just go to one person. Okay. So right here, this is actually going to be the end.
I just want to clarify that point real quick. So I'm not saying that if you're getting a diagnosis, you should go to two people. What I'm saying is if you get a diagnosis from two different people, they could like land different diagnoses, which is usually why it's good to have, like as a clinician, to consult with your colleagues. So a good clinician would consult with several colleagues before making a diagnosis. As an individual, you have a right to, seek out second opinions, and I would encourage you to do so. I'm not trying to say that you have to do it all the time, but any clinician worth their salt would, that's an old saying, seek a consultation with their other colleagues.
For the causes of psychopathology, for the classification discussion, if you have any questions, come to office hours, Tuesdays, 3 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time.
The funny thing is, our office hours this year are probably going to be those because, I received the responses, and so Tuesdays still work for most people. If you didn't fill out the office hours doodle poll that I put up, I don't know, since like the first day of class, by the time you watch this, it's too late. And I'll go to let's finish this video, then I'm going to go into a little bit of a rant.
Send me an email if you want a deeper understanding, or come to office hours. I'm here to help you out the best that I can. I would encourage you to read more. I would encourage you to research more, and then send me an email. But other than that, that's it for this section. Make sure you are doing the participation points, and make sure you're doing the reading questions. All right.
Well, that point still stands. Make sure you email me after you read the syllabus. So now we're going to get to the end of the video, and here's my little rant. So right now, this is Sunday, January 31st, 2021. This is the end of the first week of class, and I still have 5 students who haven't even signed in the Compass, which is fine. And I had about 12 students that didn't do the participation points, which is fine, and we'll see how many people do the reading quizzes. There's no excuse that I will accept for work that is not turned in, especially when you're not even logging in the Compass. And I want to let you know that I can see when you've logged in the Compass. I can see how long you're logged in the Compass. I can see what items you viewed on Compass and for how long you viewed those items. I can see how long it took you to finish the quizzes. I can see how long you looked at each of the problems before you answer them. I can see a lot of things on Compass. So I would encourage you, do your due diligence, watch the videos that I post on Compass, check your emails, and complete the work. Participation points, you can do about half of those. Like, when I say half of those, I mean like getting 5 out of 5s and still get full points. I would encourage you to do that because you're probably going to miss a few, as some of you have already found out. So you might want to do all of them. When it comes to reading questions, there are no makeups for reading questions. I would encourage you to do the reading questions. When it comes to things like our big unit quizzes, we have 6 of those. One of them is coming up next month. If you skip a quiz, that counts as your lowest quiz grade. Now remember, your lowest quiz grade drops. I would encourage you to do all 6 quizzes, even if you didn't study for them. Something's better than nothing. Trust me. Some people surprise themselves, I would encourage you to watch these videos early in the week. Some of you were trying to access content on Thursday, and the participation points are due on Friday. So, what do you think is going to happen? So I would encourage you, if you're having problems accessing things, contact me. After something is already due, I'm not going to let you take it again because you couldn't access it. You should have tried to access it before it was due, and then let me know if you had any problems. This is going to be the same thing for the assignment for all the work this semester. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to end this video, just like I said in this video that we watched together. Please email me if you have questions. Come to office hours. Make sure you're signing up for the in-person discussion sections. They are not live yet. We'll send out more information when that's ready for you. That's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.